All right, Phil. I'm about to pretend that I know what the Fed is going to do. What do you
Okay.
think about that?
Good luck to
Exactly. Okay. So, me, you, and no one else can control the macro environment that they operate in, but they can position their cash so their macro environment doesn't kill them. Uh, I'm Josh Notes. This is Financial Clarity Live. Across the table from me is Phil Maffei, my business partner, co-host. He is the CFO that leads our team here at Sustain CFO, and I'm the founder who's been bankrupt and built it all back. So today we're going to help make the numbers speak so that you can stop hiding from them. Okay, this is Financial Clarity Live, and today the topic is inflation, geopolitics, and what it actually means for your cash position, or at least your business. Okay, so most founders treat macro like the weather. Phil, you said very recently, dress for the weather outside, not the one you're hoping for.
you.
So, can you tell us why you say that?
Yeah, I think optimism is great. A lot of the time, it's our role to be the realist in the room, right? So if you're sitting in there telling me how great it is outside, and I'm looking out the window on a rainy day, I just I find it hard to believe you if what you're saying doesn't align with the world I'm looking at, right? I think weather's an easy example to give, but look, I think when you get into business and some of the nuance there, right? You could sound just as silly and not realize it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, yeah, fair enough. And like the weather, things change quickly, right? You might wake up in the morning, depending on where you live, and it's 40 degrees Fahrenheit. But by the time you get to recess, it's 79. How are you going to dress?
Hmm.
It depends.
It depends.
Cold blooded or warm blooded. All right. So jumping right in, the macro environment, especially for small business, can feel pretty distant, right? Unless it shows up in your P&L. So more and more, we've got a world that seems to be, getting smaller and more tightly impacted by things from faraway regions. But we still see this disconnect, right? $5 million business. Um, what the heck does inflation in South America mean to them? Right. I happen to live very close to Washington, D.C., and also operate on a main street that's been around longer than this country. But I can tell you those two things are tightly connected. Slight sidebar story, Ellicott City, Maryland, pretty cool mill town, literally the spot where the train raced against the horse to launch the Industrial Revolution. But the one that it was built for back in the 1700s is not the same one now. There's a lot of building around it. And sometimes it rains a lot. We get 8 inches of rain, it all funnels down, and we flood. We got about 10 feet of water running through our office back in 2018. Well, we had to go to Washington to ask for effectively a bailout. Now they're building a $70 million tunnel underneath our office. Pretty interesting connection there. But that's how macro interacts with our local situation. But look, most folks are out there saying, I don't have time to study the Fed. It's only a quarter point. Why does this matter? Phil, can you give us an idea of why this matters?
And it's every business is going to be unique, right? So we always caveat with that. Whereas what's going on in Argentina doesn't matter to most businesses, right?
Right.
Borrowing rates and risk-free rates matter to every business. So I think it's kind of you don't necessarily need to understand what happens if the at the next Fed meeting, but you do need to understand what happens if your cost of borrowing goes to some theoretical level or it drops to some theoretical, right? And understand to the idea of dressing for the weather, right? It's being prepared for the 60-degree day or the 40-degree. Maybe you put a t-shirt underneath a hoodie and you can take the hoodie off if you need to, but you don't have to, right? And it's what we always preach is having an awareness where if you are interest rate sensitive, right? Think asset portfolio, lenders, interest rates are important to you. Everyone's house, they understand that if they have a mortgage, right? If you're in an environment where rates are high, it's going to cost you more. So, I don't think instead of trying to predict what it's going to be exactly, it's going to say, hey, this is where things are today. And if they go up a couple points or if they go down a couple points, this is what it means for my cash flow. And can I live in a world where things go against me, right? Or if things are going in the direction that's favorable for me, how do I take advantage of that? So it's not about, picking one direction. It's about being prepared for any direction.
Okay. Well said. All right. So here's three things to track. Everything else we're saying is noise. Um, Inflation. Okay, that's a word that I don't really remember it being anything but a boogeyman going through business school. Um, Force two, geopolitics, and force three, rate environment. I'm going to give you the first crack at it. Grab one of those and run with it.
I mean, we're, it's interesting. We're working with two clients right now having very different conversations because one of them sources all of their products here in the US and the other one sources some of them in Brazil, right? So tariffs are a big component of the cost of goods sold. We're just recently, given all the ambiguity, getting some at some point in time supposed to get a six-figure check back from the federal government because we overpaid on tariffs last year, right? So walking through these conversations with a client where that is a factor, it becomes a much more complex discussion as opposed to, yeah, source this here, that what Trump does and what happens with tariffs next week, whether they're 50% or 20%, isn't going to impact my business versus our other client where it's very much going to impact their business to the point where do we need to consider other suppliers in other countries that aren't as affected by these geopolitical issues, right? So again, not everyone's sourcing things overseas, but if you are, you need to keep your eyes peeled and make sure you understand in what is a very ambiguous, murky, fast moving situation, what the impact of, if someone laid 25%, 50%, 75% tariffs on the things you're importing, could you still continue to do business, right? And understanding that sensitivity goes a long way to avoiding a lot of problems. So
Yeah, I
geopolitics are
mean,
super
personal
important.
story here. My energy development business had over $10 million worth of solar panels on a ship with tariffs changing, and had to make some pretty important calls. And luckily, we had the infrastructure in place and the relationships in place to decide what ports they landed at. But the wrong decision there could have been in the millions of dollars and literally flipped the business upside down. Um, so we're saying, hey, look, these three things don't add up; they multiply because a lot of times they all go in the wrong direction at the same time. And
That's right.
so it's not something that is just like, I'll just ride this out like maybe a localized recession or, a seasonality shift. These are things that once they're put in place, they're kind of hard to undo. And if they're baked into your supply chain and you don't even understand it until they show up, and we're seeing this right now with gas prices. You may not even have thought it's like, oh, I'm not going to be impacted. I source everything from the US, except that the price of gas has gone up, 30, 40%, and everything's still moving by truck. And so everything's going up. And that's an inflationary pressure. And if it's not affecting your business, it's probably affecting you personally. So, all right, let's get off the noise and keep it moving. So, a specific translation or action for every operator. So, here's exactly how the macro forces might show up in your business. They might show up in the top line in revenue. They might show up in the middle of your COGS. They might show up in your OPEX, or they might show up in your cash. I guess, Phil, how would you tell folks to go looking for them if we're playing hide and seek?
And the likelihood is that they're going to show up in one place. They're going to show up in all of them, right? And I think this just speaks to understanding that good sensitivity analysis is important because the environment within which we operate is always changing, right? And kind of alluding to the earlier point, you know, understanding where the thresholds are and what, if anything, you can do about it, is important, and having time to do something about it even more important, right? So if you can restructure debt, if you're if that's a viable option, right, in advance, even in a rising interest rate environment, right? Inflation is always a factor. So if you could buy something now, you have the cash, it's going to more likely than not be cheaper than buying it later, assuming it's not something that's perishable, right? So embedding these types of decisions in your processes will just make you better at understanding that whichever way the wind blows, I know which head, I know that that's a tailwind for something and I need to be moving in that direction, right? There's a lot of things on this chart you can't control, right? The exchange rate between pounds and euros, but you can't hedge those positions, right? So it's
Mm-hmm.
just kind of understanding what your options are, and if that's something you have sensitivity to. I work with a great, now a CFO, one of my Dun& Bradstreet days, who taught me in treasury management, your goal isn't to make money, it's to not lose money. So, kind of understanding the little things you can do that'll make you disciplined no matter what environment you're in, and taking advantage of, where the opportunities are, because as we know, within all of this chaos, right, opportunities present themselves. So if you can look at things with a clear head, with a plan of action, regardless of which direction things go, you're just going to be more likely to seize those opportunities, as opposed to panic and make bad decisions, because you're reacting as opposed to being proactive.
All right. So how do you actually like listen for this? Do you turn on Bloomberg every morning? Like the local news probably ain't telling you about it. Like, what do who's got time to read the whole Wall Street Journal or the Economist? Like, how do you synthesize this?
I mean, it's kind of it shows itself in very simple types of activities that you should and can be doing from a forecasting perspective, right? You may not see anything at a macro level, at least that what the news is going to tell you, but in the market you operate in, right, you could have some macro event that causes a bunch of customers to leave the marketplace, or whatever it may be. So it's certainly going to be industry specific, but we always talk about things like break even analysis and scenario analysis, that all of these items you see here, to a certain degree where they're relevant, become drivers in the forecast. And then building a good forecast involves pressure testing the sensitivity of those drivers to say, at what point do these things break. And then instead of listening for every little clue, I'm listening for, hey, if the Fed goes to, I don't know, make up a number, 10%, right? Something not anywhere near this. That's where I got to kind of, that's the number I'm listening for, not what happened at the next meeting,
Mm.
or how far away from that are we really, and what are the realistic odds of getting to something like that, right? So I think it's kind of going back to, building things from the bottom up to pressure test. That was always a good course of business, because that, you will see what happens if you translate your dollars back at $1.50 versus $1.55, or you'll be able to understand where, how much cost of goods sold increases you can absorb before your margins become unprofitable, right? And I think it's at these thresholds that you're listening for, as opposed to just all the news, right? It's just what's relevant to me, and I know that I'll have some level of understanding where, if these things are happening, I can kind of put my ear up and know where I need to adjust course, because I've already looked at, hey, I can't, this is not sustainable, so I need to do something about it at a certain level.
So yeah, what I'm hearing is it's not necessarily about watching more news or getting more news sources. It's about knowing your thresholds and then knowing when you're getting close to them. All right. So the right question isn't what will macro do. It's what survives if macro goes against us. Like you said, you gotta optimism tends to run in the entrepreneurial blood, and it's for a reason, because you're probably getting up one day to start something that doesn't exist, and you're having to tell yourself a certain story to get up and do that. But as this thing matures, and you go from your base case to your best case, and you start living in that world, it can be hard to undo that psychology. I've been there before, especially if you're on a road show pitching that every day. It becomes embedded in your personal narrative, and you start to depend on it for really like your own ego success. And that's okay. You got to tell a certain story out to the market to go raise capital and get to the next level of growth, but you also need to have reality baked in, and that's where we're talking about. So wrong questions. We're saying where will the Fed go next? Will the war end soon? Is inflation under control? Trying to predict macro is a fool's game. And again, unless you're selling newspapers, like that's not what you need to be talking about. The right questions are like, what's our runway if input costs spike 25%? What's the first thing we cut in Q3 if it's worse than expected? What's our financing backstop if we need it in 6 months? So I don't know. Talk about base case versus stress and macro chaos.
There, again, this idea of a base case, right? That's, you kind of look at it as, what I tell folks is like, I wanna make the best case, like the best guess I can, using all the information available to me, right? So that's my base case. And then, if you're doing this properly with the right bottoms up drivers, you could say, well, what if, all of these assumptions I made were wrong by 25% or 10% or two, and going in both directions, right? And you can create a downside case and an upside case off of that base case, right? So that's what I always kind of work with folks to work in that direction. So let's understand the fundamental drivers. Let's get as realistic a view of that as we possibly can, and that's the number that we work off as our base case. And then let's pressure test that where we say if things go against us or they go in our favor, what does that look like for cash? And then make decisions accordingly, right? So it's never just one outcome, it's a range of outcomes, starting with the best information we have possible, and then saying, hey, what if we deviate from this to 5 orders or 10 orders or whatever seems within some realm of possibility, right? Kind of where do those threshing, I'm going to go back to, right? Where do those thresholds exist where now I'm not operating profitably anymore, right? Those are the always important questions to ask ourselves, right? Where does the minimum gross margin I need? What's the most OPEX I can spend in a given month that I can absorb? And understanding that information makes you a better decision maker because you can know where the edges are and can adjust accordingly when you get close to them.
Nice. Brings me back to my trading days and the straddle, I believe it was called. Got to make sure you understand that. So
strangles and straddles.
Yeah. Shout out to Augie out there on the channels making it happen. All right. Macro doesn't whisper. That's right. It's pretty loud on the TV, but real CFOs make it speak. We think we are real CFOs. We're just fractional ones. So we like to say the numbers don't lie, but they might just sit there with all the macro information baked in. So we got to get them to speak, right? So let's talk about the finance functions and how they fit together and how this information comes to light. So a bookkeeper is logging what's happening. They're recording the variance. They're not really doing any forward translation. We love our controllers out there, but we are not them. They're categorizing the variance, explaining the past, still really not in that macro lens. Then we get to that CFO level where we've obviously hung our hat on the door, where we are reading the information at macro level, making sure that the exposure to that is baked into the model, and then running those scenarios so that we're getting updates, within the time frame, whether it be weekly, biweekly, monthly, what have you. It's this translation process, translation of information into numbers. That's what we think we do really well. Phil, tell me how we do it and why we need the other folks to get it done.
It's there's an old saying, garbage in, garbage out, and everyone's got a role to play, right? And all of these roles are important in a larger scale business. Maybe you're at a point now where all of them are being played by one person. Maybe that's fine for where you are. But ultimately, the finance function needs to grow with the business, so they have all the other areas of it, and everyone needs to be in their seat and playing their role. And these first two components are I always kind of say the foundation upon which that real good analytics can happen on top of, right? If you put garbage into the system, you're going to get garbage back out, no matter how good your CFO is. So there is a role to be played by everyone, and as you just alluded to, right? As you scale and where people find us is we're solving a problem that their existing team, which is usually a bookkeeper and maybe a bookkeeper or controller, isn't solving for the reason you see here. It's because it's not a part of their job description to be the one to help you with your strategic decision making, right? It's their job to do controllership, make sure your books are accurate, closed on time. That's their job, right? So it's understanding the different roles within a finance organization. We do a lot of this education. You can find, I'm sure, plenty of other episodes of this show regarding, where those lines get drawn and between different various, operational folks within a business. But, we rely on the downstream work very heavily to be done efficiently and accurately so that it sets up the rest of the organization for success, that you can do good strategic analytics based on good, accurate information.
Yeah, absolutely. And we love our bookkeepers and our controllers out there. We're not knocking them in any way, shape, or form. But if you've got one pitching you on CFO services, you need to ask yourself, how are they playing these roles that are very different? Because there's a lot of folks out there that are bookkeepers that are masquerading as CFOs, and we just say, beware, buyer beware. All right, keep it rocking. Cash strategy should adapt to the macro you're in, right? So it's like You can only outrun these situations for so long. There's a lot of bullet points here. We're not going to hit them all, but why don't you grab one, maybe based on the situation that we're feeling right now? This episode will probably air in May. So what of 2026 is coming into view that folks need to be adapting to? And it depends on the industry, obviously, but grab one, rock with it.
Well, you know me, I was like this last one because it's just a combination of all the other three, right? And kind of speaking to what I've been talking about this whole episode, where you got to look at the things that are potentially relevant for your business and understand what your exposure is to all of them, and you'll see here, right, what you should do in given certain circumstances. But I think it's being aware of what those potential scenarios look like, and then how you act accordingly. We'd already talked a little bit about buy things now if you got the cash for it, or hedge your FX exposure if that is a big component of your business. All things you could do and should be doing, but I think you got to plan for the worst and hope for the best. And that old saying, right, where it's don't be so delusional that you don't think that any of these things are going to impact you, because they most certainly will, and they are outside of your control.
That's right. And if your strategy feels silent or static, you probably need somebody else in the room. Okay, if you wanted to run this on your cash position this week or next week, first thing, here are 4 audit questions. What are your top 3 macro exposures? Be very specific here. This is not looking for buzzwords. This is an internal conversation. What if each got 25% worse next quarter, and you think that's not possible? Read the news. 3, what's the floor? What's your floor where these cash positions, cannot go below without restructuring? Most founders have never named this because it's scary as hell, to be frank. And then lastly, what's your macro alert system? You talked about this. Got to have those thresholds in place that you're watching monthly. If you don't have them, you're effectively, jumping out of an airplane without a parachute. So don't do that. So block 90 minutes, build 1 page, name these signals, and then schedule this as a quarterly or monthly review. If you feel like you need a partner to run through this with you, we think we could be that partner. We have a program called Free CFO for a Week, or CFO for a Week. You can see the link right there. It usually starts with our diagnostic. So again, if you're looking for some support, go ahead and snap pick of this QR code. That'll take you to a 15 question assessment that's going to lead you to a phone call with me. I'm going to meet you where you're at. We're going to help you get to where you want to go. And we're going to bring our team in to support you in that if that's what you'll want. We hoped you enjoyed the show. We thank you for joining us. If you did, go ahead and join our newsletter, Finance in Focus, for weekly financial tips, updates, and Q&A from this episode. And then as always, we're going to be on next week, 3 p.m. Eastern, for our next episode. We're going to help you gain financial clarity live. Hope to see you there.